Hey everybody, Tal here. We're getting into some new stuff. This is definitely going to be a lot more light and airy than what we've been going over previously. We've been looking at some intense positional concepts like isolated pawns, hanging pawns. We're just going to do a fun section on the games of Mikhail Tal. We're going to do it in a serious way because I do want to take a serious look at his games, but this will definitely be a bit more irreverent of a subject matter because the games of Mikhail Tal, they're brilliant, but some things in life are meant to be enjoyed aesthetically rather than looked at scientifically. When Tal first came onto the scene in the late 1950s, he was the precise antithesis to the suffocating scientific style of Mikhail Tal. His games are very much an art rather than a science. So I think it's good to analyze anything, but some things are meant to be looked at and aesthetically appreciated rather than scientifically explained. But I do want to try to dispel some myths about Mikhail Tal that I think still popularly exist. Some things about his play that I just think are complete bullcrap, which I can't say the word I actually want to use, but bullcrap. The first game I chose, this was when he was 16. He actually started in chess fairly late. He wasn't the sort of child prodigy that Samuel Reshevsky or Paul Morphy or Bobby Fischer were. He's very much started late, but once he got going, he improved just immensely in a very short amount of time. And even his early games show the style for which he would become very, very quickly known. So this is a game against Isaac Birbrager. Never heard of him before. Basically a red shirt for this game. So Tal is black. 6 c5. So, and we'll get into the precise position. So this is the modern Benoni. One thing I think doesn't get discussed enough about Tal is his contribution to modern opening theory. It's never explicitly said that he wasn't much of a theoretician, but I think the idea exists that he was just sort of a practical player, that he never did much serious opening work, that he was very much an artist of the board, and he never really prepared much. To the contrary, he basically more or less invented the modern Benoni. When you look at modern Benoni games before Mikhail Tal, the only really well-known one was a Marshall Nimzovich game from the early 20s. Other than that, it didn't even have a name. It wasn't called the modern Benoni. It was called Irregular Opening. Tal basically took this opening and just, out of nothing, invented an entire aggressive attacking system. And it shows in the games from that time. Hardly anyone knew what to do against this opening. And it was absolutely perfect for Tal because it so perfectly matched his aggressive devil-may-care style. It was like, for those that don't know, and we'll see the opening here, but the modern Benoni is more or less, in my opinion, a supercharged King's Indian. It has the same attacking themes as the King's Indian, with more clear positional imbalances baked into it. And there's no way for the position to stay closed either. So absolutely perfect for Tal, and he basically invented this opening out of nothing. Like, it hardly existed before he came along. And from this not even a child prodigy, but this 16-year-old, 18-year-old, when he first played in the Soviet Championship, I think that was 1957, he would have been 20. And he just invented this opening out of nothing. He also contributed to the Open Sicilian immensely, from both sides, if only from just absolutely annihilating people from both sides of the board with it. Certain lines of the Poison Pawn and the Najdorf just came along immensely just because of his praxis. So he was absolutely crucial to the development of modern theory. Knight c3. So this is the starting position for the modern Benoni. And it's also still it's a hard opening to work out, even today. Nowadays, it's viewed, when it's sort of come full circle from Tal's day. When he first started playing this in the early 1950s, people looked at it with a heavily raised eyebrow because it wasn't positionally correct. There was a time in the 70s and 80s where it was incredibly popular and everyone was playing it. Now it's sort of come back to that, and it's very dangerous to play as black just because these sorts of sharp positions are easily prepared by computers. And objectively, I think black is worse. But these are also difficult to prepare for either side, because when you look at any of these positions, same with King's Indian positions, the engine hates black's position, even more than King's Indian positions. So it's difficult to prepare for either side because the theory does get so sharp and concrete. I will say I think objectively black is probably worse. Maybe even a little bit more than the King's Indian, unfortunately. But they're still very fun positions to play. And if you can be a modern Benoni specialist and have a real grasp on the theory and the subtleties and the ideas, you're going to get some very quick crushes because it is a supercharged aggressive opening. So, knight f3. This is sort of a lackadaisical way of playing, the crucial modern way of playing. f4. It has a couple of different names. It's called the flick knife. In some circles, I've always heard it as the Taimanov. Bishop e7, bishop e5. So this is the key modern subtlety, and it's what got attention on 7f4 to begin with. Before this, e5 was looked at, that's unsound. Knight f3 was looked at, that's sort of lackadaisical. Well, bishop e5 check is sort of a key move. If on either knight bd7 or bishop d7, white flat out wins with e5. Both knight bd7 and bishop d7 are more or less directly unsound. So knight fd7 is more or less forced. a4, this is necessary to stop a quick a6 and b5. That's a key idea in the modern Benoni because that's your queenside majority. You want to get that moving. Queen h4 check, this is seen as a key modern subtlety. Basically, you're saying that g3 is a weakening. And knight a6, so the knight, this is also a common deployment for the modern Benoni. Here, the knight can head to this hole on b4. Objectively, I think white is better here, and maybe even significantly better, because this is a huge edge in space, and this e-pawn break is white's main positional and attacking idea here. That said, I think if you know the position and you know the theory and you're resourceful as black, you're going to get your share of points here. There's a dichotomy between how the engine evaluates it and the results, and that's because we are fallible carbon-based creatures. Same exists with King's Indian. You look at the King's Indian with basically any engine, and it absolutely hates black's position. But then you look at the numbers, black gets his share of points, just because the positions are so sharp, and any mistake by white basically just ends up getting crushed. Same here in the Benoni. But that's the modern system. Knight f3 is not necessarily bad, but it's not why the Benoni's looked upon with suspicion nowadays. Bishop g7, bishop d3. So this is a little bit of this is definitely an inaccurate move order. Modern move order would be h3 here to stop bishop g4. And this is the other system that gives Benoni players a headache. If it weren't for f4 in this position, I think the Benoni would be fine, more or less. The main modern line, basically, white's idea is that he just reinforces the e-pawn. He's just going to play bishop f4. Now the bishop has h2 to retreat to. And he's just threatening the very simple idea of knight d2, knight c4. That c4 square is where this knight belongs, more or less, because it's attacking that weak pawn on d6. So the main modern line. And theory continues for a while here. I think black is holding this position. I don't think this line is as critical as the Taimanov, but it's very prohibitive for both sides. The theory here goes out to pretty absurd lengths as well. But bishop d3 is an inaccurate move order. Castle, that's not the way to take advantage of it. Bishop g4 punishes not playing h3. Basically, in the Benoni, this bishop doesn't really have a clear role. This bishop on g7 is absolutely crucial to all of black's plans. But the bishop on this light square bishop doesn't really have a space. So whenever you can, you want to trade that bishop off for that knight to enhance your control over e5. Because at e5 square, if white ever achieves a favorable e5, black is dead. So by trading that bishop off for that knight, you get rid of a superfluous piece and you enhance your control of that square. So castle's not the best. Castle, of course, h3 we get back into the main theoretical system. But again, this system didn't exist back in 1953. Now, this was Mikhail Tal basically came up with this opening out of the history books. So people were just making things up on the board. Knight a6. This is certainly not the most accurate. Again, modern knowledge, we see that bishop g4 is the way to go. Or And here's another interesting point of disagreement between computer and mankind. Computer still gives white a small edge here. I completely disagree, and I think most strong players would disagree, and I think anyone that plays the Benoni successfully would absolutely disagree. I think black's at least equal here, but I think practically black would be the side that I take every time, just because black's play is so clear. Just get the queen side pawns moving. Sometimes that'll involve queen c7, c4, rook b8, b5, something like that. White's counterplay is nowhere to be seen. There's not a knight that we can put on c4, or else it'll take a while to get that knight there. So bishop f4 isn't a huge threat. Black has clear play, and white doesn't. And for the bishop pair, one of those bishops is that bishop on d3, which is a pretty bad piece. It's interesting how humans and computers still disagree. There are some positions where I'd absolutely believe the engine 100% over any human being. But a position like this, I think engines still have problems understanding the dynamics of the play. But knight e6 is a mistake. This is a common maneuver in some positions, but here it's just completely inappropriate. Knight d2, again, that c4 square is very attractive for this knight. I think h3 is still the most accurate. And this is a very favorable version of the system for white, because this knight's on c7, it can't come to d7 to help control that e5 square. So after bishop f4, white has two main threats. You have knight d2, knight c4, but also preparing e5 long term. But knight d2 is not bad. Knight b4 is sort of a one-off threat. Bishop b2. a3, just kicking the knight away, that's fine. Rook e1, sort of a routine move. f3 might be the move I would go with. And after all this, we've actually transposed to more or less modern opening theory. There were like 400 games in my database from this position. White scores very well. Just this pawn chain is so incredibly solid for white. Black's not achieving any central pressure. And knight c4 and bishop f4 is actually a pretty strong threat. So rook e1's not necessarily bad. Queen c2 is, though. The queen, so white is playing queen c2 so he can try to get knight c4 in. But that queen is absolutely misplaced. If only because the rook on e1 is now not guarded. So a bunch of tactics on taking on d5, if this bishop ever moves, now suddenly work. But the queen absolutely does not belong there. h3. a6. And actually, I think black is suddenly doing all right here. I think this choice of rook e1 back here was definitely a little bit more inaccurate than even the engine shows. I think suddenly black is achieving perfectly good play here. The b5 square can be a good jumping off point for his lighter pieces. Also, b5 playing the pawn break b5 suddenly works because it'll actually open up the b file for black. So h3, I think white's just in a normal position. Queen c2 is an outright mistake, in my opinion. Rook b8, I think a6 might be a little bit better. Long term, black's main idea in modern Benoni is always to get these pawns moving. Because white has this central majority with his pawns. He's got 3 versus 2 in the center, so he wants to get those pawns moving. White has 3 versus 2 in the queen, or black has 3 versus 2 on the queen side. You always want to be looking for ways to get your pawn majorities moving and active. Not only to potentially create a passed pawn in the endgame, but to gain space, be aggressive, chase your opponent's pieces away. a6, I think, is most accurate here. And this is similar to the line we just looked at, so I think black is fine. But rook b8 is okay. a4, I think b4. And this is a good example of a move that wouldn't have been played, I think, even 30 years ago. Back in the 70s or 80s or even 90s, a move like this was very difficult to make. Because it's so ingrained in our heads that you want to be playing on the side of the board in which you have an advantage. So we often think the queen side is for black, and then the center and king side are for white. But this b4 move actually looks to blockade the queen side, so black doesn't make any progress. So this takes the sting out of any b4 push, or b5 push from black, because b4 isn't possible. So it immediately blockades things up. E7. And this is a dynamic game. I think white's a little bit better, but I don't want to overstate it. Notice that rook a7 doesn't work here. And the rook drops off. But since white played f3, these dark squares are always going to be tender. b5 is always a good square for the knight to hop to. Something like knight h5 is a good threat, which we see later in the game, to chew in the dark squares. I think black is doing fine here. But a4 is a little bit lackadaisical. b6, sometimes in the Benoni, you don't want to play a6 immediately, because you're afraid of this a5 move being a positional threat, but here it's not. b6, it tries to repair b6, then a6, so a5 is not possible, then b5, just so the black pawns get moving nice and neat together down the board, but here it's too much time investment, just a6. And I think anyone that plays the Benoni would be very, very happy with black's position. Black can just take on c4, then play knight d7 to get this knight to potentially e5, or just take and then play b5, something like that. This is a perfectly fine position. b6 is just too slow. Knight b5. So this is absolutely doing black's work. Whenever you have a deficit in space, typically, and there are exceptions, but typically you want to trade one or two sets of minor pieces. This is doing black's work for it. In the Benoni, typically you want to trade one or two sets of minor pieces, especially that light squared bishop. So here, it's just losing time to a6, so white's the one spending time trading off that sort of bled knight into c7. But now that one set of minor pieces are off the board, there's much less of an opportunity for white to have aggressive threats directly in the king side, and that gives black a lot more hope for just getting his queenside pawns moving. So knight b5 is a huge positional error from white. Knight c4 is just much better. That's where the knight belongs. Bishop 6. And I think black can be quite happy here. Black is finally able to trade off that not terribly good light square bishop for that valuable knight in c4. And now these queenside pawns are going to get moving down the board. I think black very happy with this position. But this is worse. Rook a2. So this is very much an emergency move. It looks awkward, but basically white is planning... If black plays b5... b4 would be sort of an emergency move to plug up the queen side, and it's possible now, because that queen in c2 is defended. But black avoids that, plays queen e7 first. f3, so this is positional suicide. So, and you see this in a lot of games from the early modern Benoni, especially against Tal. And we'll actually look at I'm sure we'll look at a game of Birbrager-Tal Tal, where this move is played. Tal just absolutely ripped Birbrager-Tal apart. But these dark squares around the king side are just absolutely emaciated by this move. All of these pawns except this pawn on h2 are on light squares. That means the dark squares have no guardians whatsoever. b3 is more or less forced. Then queen f8. This is the key, of course. Black takes. This is okay for black, but queen f8 is clearly better. And I think black is a little bit better here. This pawn on d5 is going to be isolated. This queenside majority is very strong, and this bishop on g7 is incredibly strong. But f3 is just positional suicide. Knight h5. So this is very common for the modern Benoni, especially after f3 is played. I mean, sometimes the knight hops to h5 even when it can be taken. But this knight is hopping into h5 to uncover this bishop. So now this bishop is thinking about hopping to d4 to immediately take advantage of those weak light squares. And it gives this queen access to hop to squares like g5 and h4. Suddenly, out of nowhere, this is a decisive attack. But it's not out of nowhere, because f3 is the culprit here. f3 is the decisive positional error that allows all of this. And one myth that I would love... I'll push it back against now, and we'll talk more about in other games of Tal's. There was this image that Tal was this semi-correct, risky player, and then his attacks came out of nowhere. It's just incorrect. He played aggressive openings, he got aggressive positions, and wouldn't you know it, he got attacks of those aggressive positions. people didn't understand his chess because he was playing openings that he basically developed by himself. Like all of his games with the modern Benoni, people thought they were witchcraft because they'd never seen that opening before. Now, with modern eyes, we understand the opening. We understand how to defend against the attack, so it doesn't seem like witchcraft. It just seems like normal chess. So this image of Tal is this hypnotic figure that just bamboozled people with these completely incorrect sacrifices. Like, there were some practical elements to his play, but by and large, when you really sit down and look at his sacrifices, they all had a sound. Most of them had a sound basis. The sacrifice in this game, not so much, but he was only 16. But he wasn't a hypnotist. He was just playing. He was a generation ahead of his peers in terms of handling aggressive positions. He was playing openings people hadn't seen before, and he was playing sacrifices people hadn't seen before. Even though now we see that they're perfectly logical moves. So knight h5, going after the dark squares. Knight f1 is forced, so now on bishop d4 that gives white a reprieve. That lets him get that bishop into the game. But f5 is, again, always look to your pawn breaks. Pawn breaks are absolutely crucial for playing any position correctly. Here, black's just looking to open the position up to get after that white king. Because that f3 move was basically the red flag to go out for an all-out kingside assault, because those dark squares are so emaciated. So bishop d3, f4. So this is a beautiful positional choice. So now all of these dark squares are now permanently owned by black. And long term, if black doesn't break through on the king side, he can just play knight f6, knight d7, knight e5. And that knight on e5 absolutely single-handedly crushes white. It supports a queenside push, it supports a kingside push. That knight on e5 will be the best piece on the board. And there's really nothing white can do about that long term, because all of these dark squares are just completely owned by black, and white has no effective way of fighting for them, because he has no pawns in light squares. g4, white was dead anyways, but this is ending the game prematurely. Rook e2 is best. Rook f2 is a sad necessity of king h1. This shows how the game can end. And white just crashes through. So rook f2 is necessary. g5. 10 points demerited from Gryffindor for anyone that wants to take that exchange. That bishop on d4 is the best piece on the board. That rook on f2 is one of the worst pieces on the board. Why do you want to trade your good pieces for bad pieces? Even though it technically wins material, there's no reason to get rid of your good pieces for bad pieces. You can always take that rook on f2. It's not going anywhere. But black should just continue to play good chess and strangle white. So now, that knight, again, is just heading for e5, where it's going to be the best piece on the board. Black can always take that rook on f2 later. But right now, that rook on f2 is stuck anyways, so black can just continue the squeeze and let it sit there. But g4 just completely weakens the position. Queen h4, so hitting the rook on e1. Queen h3, so this isn't the sort of execution that Tal was known for. Of course, he was still on the rise, and he was only 16 at this point. Knight g3 was best, and I think Tal, even 2 years later, would have seen this move pretty easily. Getting that extra attacking unit involved is decisive. Rook g2, bishop x g4. So this is the sort of destructive sacrifice that Tal would absolutely play 2 years later, and seeing 6 moves earlier. This is all more or less forced. Rook f2, again, queen takes h2 with mate following is threatened, so queen g1 is more or less forced. Rook a2, I love this little flourish. And white will lose another minor piece. So if the rook takes, queen d3 check, or if king blocks, boop, with an absolutely winning position for black. So there's one other variation in there if you'd like to. Of course, as usual, the game comments will be in the notes, but this sort of destructive sacrifice would be completely natural to Tal only 2 years from now. Queen h3 is just too slow. Black is still winning, but it's too slow. Queen x f3. This is actually an outright blunder, and this gives away most of black's advantage. Again, this would be a very natural move that Tal would have seen very quickly. Rook takes is more or less forced. 3, and just rook e5. And white's completely paralyzed, so there's no reason to be taking... Again, the point of this exercise is not to be taking a rook. The point of this exercise is continuing to attack. So the rook lifts itself into the battle before we think about taking a rook. Rook f8. Rook g5. So this is more or less completely decisive. So now queen g2 is threatened and it doesn't have an adequate response. Or just queen g4 and then landing on g1. This is completely winning for black. So queen x f3 actually gives away most if not all of black's advantage. Threatening a perpetual. And this is the first hint of the Tal unsoundness that we see later. And it's one reason I wanted to include this game, aside from getting to talk about the modern Benoni. So, if forced to just take, black will have a rook for the queen, along with 2 pawns in a continuing attack. Now, it's not worth it. I think white is objectively winning here suddenly. But this is still an incredibly difficult position to play for white. And like Lasker before him, I think Tal was an excellent psychologist. He didn't hypnotize people, but he did take into account the practicality of how to play a position. And he intuitively and explicitly understood that it's always much harder to defend than it is to attack. So he didn't specifically, like, bamboozle people. Just the fact that he was playing such relentlessly aggressive chess wore people down, because it's hard to defend. It's psychologically miserable to defend. You know, even now, white having a winning position, this is still a miserable position, because you have to like calculate and stuff, and you have to be worried about your king and stuff, and that takes its toll on people. H4, this is an immediate mistake. Rook a3, you have to get your pieces to the fence. H4, now H4 is forced to control the G5 square. And black does not have enough compensation for the queen. He still has excellent practical chances, in my opinion, because there is that element of pressure on the white king. But H4 definitely starts to weaken the king side needlessly. Fate. Rook b2, this is a decisive mistake. b3 is much better, just connecting those pieces over to the king side. And this is more or less forced, so I just give the whole line. This is still very complicated. This is much better for whites. I think it's inappropriate to say it's winning, because there is still so much going on in the position. But this is definitely still much better for whites. But bishop e2 just, again, collapses, because it's so hard to defend, even when it seems relatively simple. Yeah, and this is just take the rook now, and then take the bishop. White just acquiesces to a losing ending. If white does something like this, this is overwhelming compensation for the queen. So now black has a bishop, a rook, and 2 pawns, with a continuing press on the king side. White can't take, because then the other rook would get involved. And this is just completely crushing, so black can just protect the c-pawn and then continue with b4 and c3. Then he has 2 overwhelming passed pawns. So white just goes into the objectively losing ending. And Tal wasn't known for his endgame technique, but Birbrager resigns here. This is 1 pawn up, but it'll soon be more material. If rook a1, just a5, then take on c1 and then play rook f4. This is completely gone. Excellent starter game from Tal. Again, the modern Benoni was more or less his creation, and he really should be known more as the father of the modern Benoni. And this whole part of modern opening theory is his. But he didn't bewitch people. He didn't hypnotize people. He just played more aggressive chess than people had really seen in decades, and he was a generation ahead of his peers in terms of his feel for dynamics. Even if it wasn't always objectively 100% correct, it was always so complicated and it was always so well connected to the dynamics of the position that he always had resources. And people would just get overwhelmed because it's so hard to defend. And we'll see so many examples of that where his opponent gets close to the finish line and they just collapse because they're just so tired of being bombarded. They've had this mad genius just throwing bombs at them for the past 4 hours, and they're just tired and they just collapse. But excellent attacking game from Tal. We'll continue the series later. My name is John. I'll see you then.